So what do you guys think about this position? Does this fit the criteria that I sort of put out for you, which was that when you have the two bishops, you're looking for a few things to do within the position. On whether the bishops are better than a bishop and a knight or whatever. The first thing is fluid pawn structure. So does white have a fluid pawn structure? Yes. White's pawns can still very much, they can move in all sorts of ways. These pawns can move. These pawns can move. The second thing is it possible to control central squares from the knight? Yes, because there is no central square which cannot be covered by white's pawns. For example, white can put the pawn on b4 to cover c5, and white can put the pawn on f4 to cover the e5 square. So there is no secure central square where black could throw his knight into and say, wow, I've got my knight to a great place. Okay. On top of that, white has a space advantage because of this pawn. But what's the most important here is the two bishops advantage and the fluid pawn structure. Okay? All right. So a6 was played, and this was played because white was threatening rook takes rook and possibly bishop takes pawn, and maybe not immediately. So, and of course, Ben Feingold points out as well, which is correct, the king is better placed on d2 than its counterpart on g8 because it's an endgame. You're going to use that king. Okay, so a6, b4, and you know that I like this move, b4, because while it does gain some space on the queen side, it also is covering some important squares in the center. And okay, so let's watch how the game progresses. Black brings over the king, and part of black's strategy may be to bring the king over to the center and then try to challenge the c-file. Okay, a4, gaining some space, knight to d7, and a5. Okay, so similarly to the English Steinitz game, where the pawns on f5 and c5 controlled the squares from the knight, here we see that the pawns on a5 and b4 really help dominate this knight, right? So you can see that the pawns are doing their job here. And remember, the knight could go to e5, but can be easily driven away by a pawn on f4. So black does not have a great way to establish a knight in the center. Okay, bishop to b2 was played. We had rook to c2, captures, bishop to b2. Okay, so here we go. King to b3 and rook to c8. Now, I have a question for the audience here. So if you're playing white, would you play the move rook to c1, where inevitably black is going to trade that, because if you play rook to c1, black isn't going to give you the open file, so you're going to trade. Would you play rook c1 as white, or would you just preserve the rooks? So many of you think rook to c1, and to be honest with you, I don't know if there is a 100% correct answer, but I would actually, I'm on Nikolai's side here that says save the rooks. So Nikolai says save the rooks, please. I really like what Polugaevsky did, and he played bishop to d2, which I think is more powerful and a more sure way of maintaining your advantage because because you keep the rooks on the board, which increases your chance of winning. You have not given away the two bishops, and so the bishops control the infiltration squares. There's no way for the rook in. And what Polugaevsky is going to try to do here, because he has that fluid pawn structure on the king side and in the center, is he's going to try to open up an avenue for his rook by initiating pawn play in the center and on the flank. on the king side. So I like the fact that Polugaevsky decided to stop the basic threat of rook to c3 with bishop to d2, but preserve the rook, which in my opinion increases white's advantage if you keep the rook on the board. Because when white inevitably opens the game, which is going to happen, white will initiate a series of pawn moves to open the game on the king side or in the center. Having the two bishops is already great, and then having a more active rook when that happens is icing on the cake. So I like Polugaevsky's decision, bishop to d4, pawn to g4, here we go, and king to g7, and then Polugaevsky played g5, which I also like very much. Because maybe black had some ideas of playing h6 and g5. And then black could argue that he will secure the e5 square for his knight. So I'd like for you guys, let me just play some bad moves for white just to show you what I mean. Let's say white played here, and I played here, and white played here, and I played here. I know that's very unrealistic, okay? But because the pawn's on g4 and e4, you have no way to use a pawn to chase the knight off of the e5 square. So the knight camps itself on the e5 square, and there's no reason why that knight would be inferior to the bishops if it has a protected central square to camp out on. Okay, so white cannot allow this to happen. So Polugaevsky played the move g5, which I like a lot. Because what g5 does is it stops black from playing g5. And again, knight to e5 is simply not a permanent threat, or really a threat at all, because it can always be driven away by pawn to f4. So I like Polugaevsky's move, g5. It's a prophylactic measure against a possible defensive setup for black. So rook to c7, rook to d1, king goes back, and then f4. So the space still remains, the bishops remain, and now it's just a matter of how to open the position. Are we going to play e5? Are we going to play f5? Are we going to play h5? Are we going to play all of them? I don't know yet, but the cards are in white's hands. You know, white gets to decide here what happens. Black does not have a constructive way to break without damaging his position. So black waits. Rook to c8, bishop to g4. I love this move a lot, increasing the power of the bishop. King to e8, rook f1. Polugaevsky's waiting. A lot of moves here may lead to Athens, but it's a slow process for white as he's proceeding very delicately to make sure that he does the right things. He doesn't want to compromise anything. He still has all the breaks in the position. Black is waiting. White's figuring some things out. Rook c7, h4. We already knew this was coming. He wants to break on h5 and open the avenue for the rook. Here, you can see how important it is to have a rook on. It just makes your chances of winning so much easier. Because as this king side opens, you could see the rook infiltrating over there. Okay, bishop to g7, h5. We already knew that was coming. No surprises there. Bishop to d4. So we're waiting. Well, black is waiting. White is just trying to figure out the way in. Rook to h1. Preparing a possible capture on the g-pawn and infiltration. Bishop to g7. Rook to h3. Once again, very, very, very calm play by Polugaevsky. He's not compromising anything. King to f8, and now very interesting decision here, which I like very much. He plays h6, which is like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? He did all that just to not open the h-file? You have to be kidding me. But you'll see method to his madness. The bishop goes to d4, rook comes over to d3, and he's just going to initiate one of the pawn breaks down the center. Bishop to a7, bishop to h3, slow and steady. Black has nothing to do. Black has nothing to do. Black has to wait. The bishops, the space. Look at this knight. Anyone who would prefer to have a knight and bishop here versus these two things in conjunction with that fluid pawn mass that has just moved up the board for the last 20 moves, just, I don't know what to tell you. It's obvious white is all over black here. It's just a matter of finding the breakthrough. Bishop to g1, black has nothing to do but wait. Bishop to c3, securing the diagonal. King to e8, and finally e5. And the floodgates are going to open toward the black king. As some of you noticed, the pawn on h7 is passageway into black's position. I mean, if white can get to the pawn on h7, the game is over because the pawn on h6 would promote pretty easily. Bishop to h2. Pawn takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Rook e3. And now the bishops are just piercing through black's position along with the rook. And again, we can see that keeping the rook was better for white because white was the one who held all the pawn breaks. So it didn't make sense to trade off the rooks. When things opened up, it would only make sense to have one more piece of artillery here. Okay, king to d8, rook e4, bishop to g1. Black can't do anything. I mean, black is totally frozen here. And then after the move bishop takes d7, Ivkov resigned because, well, the problem is that he cannot stop the infiltration to the back rank. So he can't stop the rook going to the back rank and getting at the h-pawn. For example, if king takes, then bishop to f6, and the rook is coming to the 7th rank or to the last rank. And if rook takes, same thing. Bishop f6, and rook to e8 to h8. So here, Ivkov resigned, and Ivkov was a strong player. I mean, a great player, actually. And he got completely owned by the two bishops in this game. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch these videos live, be sure to follow us on Twitch.